Welcome to another episode of our podcast series, In Reality, Lessons from Leaders and Entrepreneurs, a production of the New York Institute of Technology School of Management, where business meets technology. In this episode, I'll discuss strategies for mitigating cyber risk with Perry Carpenter, a multi-award-winning author with decades of experience in cybersecurity, focusing on how cyber criminals exploit human behavior. As the Chief Human Risk Management Strategist at KnowBe4, Perry builds robust, human-centric defenses against social engineering-based threats. Our conversation will touch on how organizations can create a security culture, the need to educate the workforce in digital literacy, our over-reliance on technology to protect us, and how criminal use of artificial intelligence escalates the need to rethink the nature of cyber risk. Perry, welcome to our podcast series.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Wonderful that you could join us. Perry, so you're a successful author, cybersecurity professional, a business executive. You're the host of your own podcast, Eighth Layer Insights podcast, which focuses on the risk crossroads of human interaction with technology. Tell our audience about the journey that led you to a career in cybersecurity and human behavior.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's not a career that I planned. It's a career that I kind of stumbled my way into, in a focus area I stumbled my way into. I started out as a computer programmer and got into some of the more human sides of programming, and that I was really interested in user interface design, and that gets into the way that people think. Also ended up being somebody who did a lot of coding around email. Email connects to things like directory structures because you have to be able to look people up and find them and see their calendars and all that. And then that led me down a really weird road. But ultimately, I ended up in the situation where I was doing large-scale security-related projects. And what I saw over and over and over again is that the security technology was really good, really interesting, but was always bypassable or could be foiled in some way, either by a really motivated cyber criminal that would trick somebody into doing something, or a motivated employee that would go around some guardrails, or somebody that would just trip through all the guardrails. And so that led me down the road of really focusing on behavior, understanding the science behind deception, really trying to unpack security awareness and security culture, behavior management, and understanding the human risk dynamics involved in systems.
A section in your latest book, which is called Fake, A Practical Guide to Living in a World of Deepfakes, Disinformation, and AI-Generated Deceptions, you provided like a historical context of deception and scams. So we shouldn't be surprised at all when these old tactics are being applied today. Can you expand upon that?
Essentially, I tried to summarize a few thousand years of history and just show that deception is fundamental to human nature, and falling victim to deception is also fundamental to human nature. All throughout history, people have been after one or both of two things: money or minds, or finances or influence, being able to fatten their own wallet, or be able to move populations in different ways. And all scams really come down to a combination of those two things. Is I want to understand the way that somebody thinks, and I want to either play into their thinking so that they give me what I want, or I want to be able to influence their thinking to get them to where I need them to be so that I get what I want.
I guess this brings us into the human factor related to cybersecurity. One of the things that you mentioned in the book is it's time to remove our rose-colored technocentric glasses. Technology cannot and will never block all threats. And you talked about developing a security culture within an organization. So can you talk a little bit about what is a security culture? What are those human elements in defending against cyber threats? And is it yesterday's logic to rely so heavily on technical defenses?
I think it really is yesterday's logic. So I'll answer that question first, then I'll get into these definitions. So for decades, I and others have been going to security-related conferences like RSA and Black Hat and the Gartner Security Summit and all the others that are out there. And you go on the showroom floor where all the vendors are displaying their newest stuff, and year after year after year, what you see is vendors that have said, if you buy this thing, It will make it so that you don't have to worry about the human side of things anymore. People clicking on links or plugging in USBs or accidentally doing the wrong thing will become a thing of the past magically. And what we've seen decade after decade is that, data breaches are still happening. People are still doing those things. Those technologies that continue to promise that they will solve that bit of the human behavior piece are just not effective because they can't account for everything that a human will do in order to either intentionally or accidentally bypass all the controls that are there. What that means is that the technology will never save us. It can help decrease risk in certain areas. It is a layer of defense, or may even encompass several layers of defense for an organization. But unless we focus on humans as another critical layer of defense, we've already lost. We've seen that throughout history. And so that means that we have to understand human nature. We have to understand how to work with rather than against human nature. And once we've decided to do that, then that means that we have to understand behavior dynamics, and we have to understand things like what makes a culture move, because behavior will influence culture, culture will influence behavior, all of those will influence mindsets. And then, of course, once you've influenced all of that, then outcomes and actions will be influenced. And so when we talk about reducing risk, what I'm starting to think about, and have been for a long time now, is how do we influence the behavior? How do we influence the mindset? How do we influence all the other social factors around a person that will ultimately impact the actions that that person takes so that we achieve the reduction in risk? And then really quick, just to give you answers on some of those definitional bits. Security culture, as I've defined it in the organization that I work for, and this is based on sociological research and adaptations of definitions based on research that we've done, is that security culture is the ideas, beliefs, and social behaviors of a group that influence that organization's security. It is a subset or a bit of it runs through the fabric of a much larger organizational culture.
Almost any organization today, employees are trained in, we'll call it the rules of the road, right? That in terms of cybersecurity and what they're allowed and not allowed to do. And most recently, I remember, and I say recent, it's probably within the last several months, there was a story about an employee who believed that he was on a conference call with two executives of an organization and was asked to make a money transfer. And these were really good, I guess, AI-generated voiceovers that he was convinced. And so obviously AI has really brought a new aspect to having to play by rules, but then companies have to begin to learn to write new rules for the newest threats.
Right.
Do you see that happening? Do you believe that companies are starting to realize I can't attack problems using yesterday's logic. I've got to think more aggressively.
It's really interesting because yesterday's logic is something that we could put in quotes, I think. When I see people that are setting themselves up to fall for AI-generated scams, prior to 10 years ago when we talked about needing to authorize a transaction or something, people were extremely process-based. People talked about like dual key controls and, second levels of authorization within the organization before they would let something happen. And then we've layered some technology on things and we've reduced the barrier to falling victim to a trap for, wiring $25 million. We've reduced that down to a click or a series of clicks that can be undertaken by one person. In reality, if we'd gone back to some of the security processes of yesteryear, where you might have to pick up the phone and get another verification from somebody within the company, calling a phone number that is accurate, speaking to somebody that you very likely know is that person, then that would have prevented that. But they fell for the AI scam on a Zoom call, and there are people that are falling for scams on phone calls. And the problem is that the employee, the person that's being scammed or spoken to within that organization is reduced to a single point of failure. And that's the problem. So in a lot of ways, we need to back up our thinking prior to the past 10 to 15 years and say, what are standard old school and almost draconian militaristic ways of doing authentication and authorization? And we need to bring those forward into the era that we're in right now.
That's absolutely fascinating because obviously everybody's using new technologies to make your functions operate faster in a world where velocity counts, right? And so bolstering that human variable with cybersecurity tools that were thought about decade ago almost sounds counterintuitive, but the way you phrase it, it makes eminently good sense.
Yeah, absolutely. We're now entering a time when most people will realize that they cannot believe their eyes or ears. And there's a lot of social problems that may come with that. Fact of the matter is, people will see often enough that news stories or videos or audio clips or other things that have been presented to them have been synthetically generated and are not real or trustworthy. That's going to cause an interesting reckoning, I think, with security and risk processes, but then also just the way that people engage with media and so on. And they're going to ask interesting questions. And I think those interesting questions is kind of in the aftermath of the book that I've written. I think we're going to enter an era where we say, I don't necessarily care if the thing that's landed in front of me, whether that's a Zoom call or a video that's in my social media feed or something else in a news story, I don't necessarily care if it is synthetically generated. What I care about is why and how it got in front of me, what emotion it's trying to poke, what narrative it's trying to tell or sell, and then ultimately what it wants me to do or believe. Because at that point, I can start to unpack everything else. And then it also recognizes the fact that virtually everything that we see and that we hear and that we read will have the fingerprints of AI all over it in different ways. From filters that people use to enhance their appearance on Instagram and social media and even in the news, to the little magic help me write this buttons that are popping up in LinkedIn and every social media platform out there. There are AI tools that are touching everything, even our quote unquote real and trustworthy things. And so the question of is something synthetic or not is going to get really, really murky.
So it comes down to training and education, and you use the term digital literacy. I would imagine that you would be an advocate of seeing digital literacy, as we talk about, as an example, critical thinking skills, being taught at either the college or the high school level. And I would think the sooner the better.
Yeah, absolutely. College, high school, or even before. You know, when you look around the globe, it's interesting because some of the nations that have been inundated with the most disinformation are the most aggressive now at pushing digital literacy in their equivalent of K to 12. And they have games there's one in Europe called Bad News that's all about presenting bits of disinformation to people at a really young age so that they can see it and they can start to see the markers of it. And what we see is that when you are put through those kinds of training events, there is a payoff. You start to become more resilient. And we've not really had that here in the U.S. But when you look at like Estonia, who's been the recipient of a ton of Russian disinformation over prolonged periods of time, you look at Taiwan, who's been the recipient of Chinese disinformation for prolonged periods of time. You look at Sweden and Finland and others who have dealt with that. They have progressed and they have some models that we here in the U.S. could start to look to for inspiration for what we might want to do. I've also tried to put my effort, my money where my mouth is on that a little bit, to the point where I've released a resources book for free that accompanies my book. So if you go to thisbookisfake.com/resources, there's a free study guide. You don't even have to have the book to use it and start to get some digital literacy skills. There's some audio resources. There's some other downloads. All of those are free. You don't even have to put in an email to get them because I just want people to start thinking along these lines. And I've been lucky. I've heard book clubs that are using these resources, college professors that are using the book and the resources, and I think the message is getting out.
I know at New York Institute of Technology, we've had that conversation about immersing AI into the coursework and also having people come up with ideas in terms of how to protect themselves against AI. You know, one of the things that came across recently was the notion that a lot of people are using these public AI programs, ChatGPT, and that there should be an understanding that the data you're entering, essentially you're giving it away. And so should companies begin to write rule books on what you're allowed or not allowed to ask for help on from AI, because you may be giving away trade or proprietary secrets?
Yeah, I think it's that rule book and more. So every company should have an AI policy and AI training that explicitly lets people know what is acceptable and what's not. And by acceptable, I'm talking about the type of information you put in and ask for input on, but even more so, the systems that are authorized that you're allowed to go to. Because if anybody that's dealt with SaaS software should know, the contract is the key to being able to understand what controls and protections are put in place and where the accountability lies. Your organization may really have a good use case for, and I think every organization does have a good use case for, systems like ChatGPT and Claude and Google Gemini and others. The problem is when people go use the free versions of those tools in like a shadow AI or shadow IT way, and there's no contract, no agreement that's governing that. That's when they're accidentally giving away information that's training it. When your organization is purchasing licenses and people are using their authorized corporate accounts for that, then you have some protection. And even better than that would be for your IT team to build a web page internally that is the portal that allows people to go and ask questions inside that portal. And based on the question they're asking, it routes it to the right AI system. Because once you do that, you have the input validation. So on your side, you can be checking to make sure that there's not data that you don't want going out that's going out. You're also bringing some efficiency in the types of systems that you're routing those queries to. And then you can also be able to monitor, of course, the prompt that's being used and the output that's coming back. So you have a full auditable trail for everything that might be done on AI systems. And I think that's the route that most companies should go that have the resources to go there. If they don't have the ability to build it internally, then at least get corporate-owned accounts for those.
Brilliant. One of the aspects of securing your organization, though, is also understanding third-party risk. And most recently, I remember there was a recent incident at I believe it was the Department of Treasury, where a hardware support vendor would come in and service desktop PCs and unwittingly put in some, I believe it was malware or phishing software. Even understanding that an organization like the Treasury Department of the U.S. government could be adversely affected.
Yeah, go back a few years at this point, but remember the really big news of the Target data breach. That was a third-party air conditioner, contractor that led to that data breach. So third-party risk, it is so important because most organizations, unless they're incredibly large, and even if they are incredibly large, most organizations like to focus on their core competency. And anything that is not their core competency that they can't really derive an ROI on, they want to outsource to somebody else. And as soon as you're outsourcing to somebody else, you relinquish some control. The only way to get your control back is to do that through contracts, agreements, and audits and the regulatory process. But you don't have control. Then those third parties are also contracting with other third parties for things that they don't get ROI off and that they don't want to specialize in. So it gets really, really difficult to control. Now, the difference that you mentioned is that third party came into their environment and plugged something in, and that caused the bad day. There should be an agreement for best practices in what's allowable and what's not. But in their own internal environment, they had some things that were not as tight as they should have been if that was the vector in.
By the way, these circumstances are often murky. Oftentimes takes a while to really figure out who's the culprit here. Where did this come in? I guess that brings me to a question. If you could polish up your crystal ball for a moment, looking into the future, summarize what you believe organizational leaders, especially board risk committees, what should be, let's say, their top 3 focal points regarding cybersecurity?
I think everybody is going to have to get a grip on AI. So if people have been postponing the upskilling in their organization to understand the implications of AI and to have a AI competent workforce, it's time to do that now, because otherwise it's only going to happen in the shadows. And when it's happening in the shadows, you have no visibility or control. So you need to do that. You also have to realize that AI is going to be integrated into everything. You're already seeing that because it is integrated into Facebook and LinkedIn and Word docs and Google Docs and everything else. So realize it's there. It's going to be in the fabric of everything. We need to understand the strengths and we need to understand the opportunities that come with that. Outside of AI, we need to understand the human factors are something that we cannot ignore either. We can't just slam technology-based systems into place and hope that it's going to reduce human risk. History shows us that we need to start looking at and understanding and working with human behavior rather than against it. And then the last thing is realizing that cyber criminals are going to continue to evolve, but they will always double down on what works best. And that's why we continue to see ransomware. We continue to see phishing. We continue to see things that work because they leverage the scales of power in interesting ways. So when it comes to ransomware and phishing, your main exploit in your way into the organization is through the human. But the reason that ransomware is so powerful is because it takes and holds captive something that is valuable to us and something that when we hear that our data may not be available or our customer information may get leaked on the dark web, that is a power dynamic that's being exploited. And so anything that gives cyber criminals the upper hand to exploit that power dynamic and hold something over our heads is something that they will double down on for years, if not decades. And that's why ransomware is so prevalent today.
And will continue to be into the future. That was brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Perry. Perry, last question as we wrap up. What one word describes who you are?
That's a really good question. The one thing that I think defines the way that I view my career would be connections. So I guess describes who I am would be connector, or in the direction of the Renaissance person who is a connector of multiple disciplines to understand the overlaps and the insights that can be gained by looking at something like cybersecurity as it intersects with behavior science and sociology, as that intersects with the way that criminal minds work or the way that human creativity works and flourishes. So for me, I'm really always interested in the intersection of ideas because I think that so often there are things that we can learn from disciplines that are outside our own. And there are problems that have been solved or largely solved within our discipline that have already been solved or largely solved in disciplines that we may otherwise be unaware of.
Like you take a unified approach where you look at from a variety of different perspectives in order to get the best view, right?
Yeah.
That was terrific. Hey, Perry, thanks so much for joining us today. I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was an honor to be on.
As Perry stated, a few thousand years of history has shown us that deception is fundamental to human nature. Both falling victim to deception and perpetrating it, all scams come down to a combination of two things, money or minds. Understanding how and why we act can lead criminals to develop ways to get what they want. That can be money, passwords, information, or data. The deceiver's objective can be to influence you into believing something is untrue or not real, which causes you to react in a certain way or subtly influences your way of thinking. When discussing reducing organizational cyber risks, Perry called on leaders to develop a security culture, which he defines as a group's ideas, beliefs, and social behaviors that influence an organization's security. He views the current environment that primarily counts on software to protect an organization as overlooking the weak link in the security chain, the human component. We've entered into a time when most people will realize they cannot believe their eyes and ears. AI tools touch everything, making us question whether something is synthetic or real. So Perry suggests that we need to look back into the past 15 years or so, consider standard old-school ways of doing authentication and authorization, and bring those ideas forward into the present. We discussed having a digitally literate workforce. Perry pointed out that when you look around the globe, some of the nations that have been inundated with the most disinformation are now the most aggressive at pushing digital literacy in their equivalent grades of K through 12. As a society, we should have such programs become a standard part of our educational process. He suggests also that every company create an AI policy and AI training that explicitly identifies what is acceptable and what is not. AI licensing is a way to govern how AI technologies are used, distributed, and modified within your organization. A reminder, to help organizations with developing digital literacy programs and creating a security culture, Perry offers free resources, and these are available at This Book is Fake, and by the way, fake is spelled F-A-I-K, so it's at thisbookisfake, all one word, thisbookisfake.com/resources. And the one word that Perry used to describe himself is connection. It describes him as a connector, akin to a Renaissance person who connects multiple disciplines, giving him a holistic understanding of the world. We thank Perry for sharing his experiences and valuable insights. This podcast is executive produced by John Rebecchi and the New York Institute of Technology in conjunction with the School of Management and the Office of Strategic Communications and External Affairs. Our co-executive producer is Dr. Deborah Cohn, Professor of Marketing at the School of Management. Our social media strategist and producer is Patthara Chandaragga, and our audio editor and mixer is Brian Falk from Abacus Entertainment. Special thanks to Professor Ellie Schwartz and John Rebecchi from the Office of Development and Alumni Relations for all their support. Until next time.